There's a reason I'm not wearing mine. Okay, I knew you were interested. Yeah, I couldn't get it unless you see you first.
Finally.
I'm not wearing
Yeah, that's right.
I know.
Yes. Good morning.
Good morning.
Welcome all. Want to make sure everybody, to remind everybody, we are now live on YouTube. So in addition to being open, available to the public on YouTube, these are also recorded and can be found by the general public on our on the church's YouTube page. And we are delighted once again to have Heather McKee here teaching us about gender issues and LGBTQ as it relates to our faith, which we have heard her before. And Heather, of course, is a Davidson College grad and has a Master of Divinity from Princeton. And despite being denied the opportunity at that time to seek ordination, has continued to be a very well-read and thoughtful person. So we're just delighted that she's here to share with us this morning.
Then I'm unmuting myself.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Well, it's again a privilege to be with you all here today. And again, to reiterate a bit what I said last week, topics of sexuality and gender can be complicated and also can involve, our personal experiences, maybe of some trauma around those issues. So I want to honor your presence and thank you for your thoughtful questions and comments and for being here today. So last week, we talked about sexual identities, sexual orientation. And one of the points I made was how our biblical texts have been translated sometimes in ways that were a bit surprising and involved inserting words into the text that were never there before. And the example I used was in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 9, which was the insertion of what was a term that was derived out of German psychoanalytic theory, the term homosexual, that was placed in the biblical text in 1946. And I wanted to make the point that within the various versions of the Bible, the one that we tend to use, which is the NRSV, and I have my copy that I use today, because the RSV was the first text that was changed. But in 1971, the translation committee of the RSV realized they had made a mistake. So they went back and retranslated those two words, malakos and arsakenokotai, to sexual perverts. Now, is that better? Well, you know, I don't know, but I would argue it's actually closer to the Greek meaning that Paul was referring to. But then later, again, the translator said, we really need to reflect the underlying meaning of these two terms. So if you have a current copy of the NRSV, the text will say, and this is 1 Corinthians 6:9, do you not know that wrongdoers will not inherit the kingdom of God? Do not be deceived. Fornicators, idolaters, adulterers, male prostitutes, sodomites, thieves, the greedy, drunkards, revilers, robbers, none of these will inherit the kingdom of God. So that was changed back to an equally problematic word, which is sodomites. And we talked about that too, how that term was evolved out of an interpretation of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And we know from last week's our time together that the sin of Sodom was inhospitality and gang rape. So we still have some problematic language in here, but I just want to let you know that within the NRSV that has been changed. However, do you all know what the most popular and largest selling version of the Bible is today? Nope. Nope. NIV. The NIV. The NIV actually was a translation and a version that came out after that first, the RSV. And it was primarily done by scholars that were on the more conservative side of the fence. And to this day, the NIV still contains that term homosexual.
What does NIV stand for?
New International Version. Yeah.
And when did it come out?
I want to say the 70s. There were a lot of like new versions that came out at that point. You might remember like the Good News Bible, the Message, all of that.
I have the New English version from Oxford Press. It came out in '70.
Yeah, yeah. So I think I read somewhere there are over 30,000 versions of the Bible.
Wow.
So when somebody says well, the Bible says, ask them which version they're referring to, right? Right. So, but today we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about gender. Now, sexual identity, sexual orientation, and gender are not the same thing, right? And I don't remember this at all, but apparently when I was born, doctor held me up, looked down there and said, it's a girl. That's how we are assigned our genders. There are not tests of our DNA or chromosomes. It's a visual inspection by a physician who determines what gender we are at birth. And in many cases, that gender is congruent with the way we feel and the way we express ourselves. But there is a diversity of gender across the world, across time. And we're going to spend a little time today about how gender is defined. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the science because it is amazingly complex. And if you're interested in the science of gender, there are a couple of really good articles out there. Nature magazine has one that you could find online, Scientific America. And the BBC, I believe, did a video series on the science of gender. So I would encourage you, if you're interested, to take some time and delve into that. But today we're just kind of going to focus on the theological understanding of gender and then just do some basic 101 work. So I'm going to get started with a resource that I received from the PCUSA. I participated in a training they did, and we're going to use that as our. Let me share my screen. Okay. So let me go back to my beginning. Okay. So what gender is and what it is not. What does it mean to have a gender identity? Understanding gender norms, stereotypes, and diversity. And then gender from a biblical understanding. So how does understanding gender help build a more beloved community of faith?
Hey, Heather, excuse me.
Yes.
If you hit up where it says from beginning, that will make your show. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you.
there we go. Thank you, John Ryan. And then I can use this, I believe. So those are some of the topics we're going to discuss. So what is gender? Gender is a socially constructed classification of being in a particular category of a man, a woman, both, neither, or something in between, or something altogether different based on societal norms of what gender is. Any questions on this definition? So what this definition suggests is that gender is much more than just male or female and can encompass a range of self-understandings, but also these categories that we think of are social constructs, meaning they're determined by the culture and societies in which we live. And I'll give you an example of something that I personally encountered. I was really fortunate in my mid-40s to do what I call my midlife year abroad. So I took an around the world backpack tour. And one of the places I visited was Western Samoa. And for those of you who may have taken some anthropology in your undergrad, you may remember Margaret Mead. Now, Mead's theories have been controversial and in some places discredited since then. But Mead looked at the society of Western Samoa because it had, in many ways, I don't want to say rejected, but had been able to resist some of the colonialist Christian overlays and was still a traditional society in many ways. Well, when I went to Western Samoa, one of the things that I noticed was the prevalence of a third gender. People called the Fa'afaiin, and the Fa'afaiin were folks who were assigned male at birth, but yet were enculturated, raised to take on more female stereotypical roles in their society. And they were considered integral parts of Samoan culture and society. There wasn't much discrimination. They had roles. They were helpers in the home usually. They did a lot of things to support what they call the Agia, which is the larger family group. So that really was the first time that I'd encountered a culture that wasn't just this hard gender binary. And it really opened my eyes. And then I went on to other places in Southeast Asia where, gender norms were different, and they did not necessarily abide by this stereotypic male-female duality. So gender is a social construct, and these categories can be man and woman or anything beyond that or including that. Baseline definitions. So let me see if I can. Oops. Can you all read that? Huh? Sorry. Okay, that's better. Thank you, Jane. So these are just some definitions. Sex, again, a social construct of identifying one's biological makeup determined at birth. Now, doctor assigns male or female based upon a visual inspection. Now, gender identity is how someone internally experiences and defines themselves according to what they determined the options for gender to be. And last week we talked about sexual orientation, which is who you are attracted to sexually, emotionally, romantically, or intellectually. And gender identity does not necessarily determine one's sexual orientation or vice versa. And then identity is the qualities, the beliefs, the personalities, the looks and expressions of what constitutes our mental models of ourselves. And a psychological identity relates to our self-image, our self-understanding, our self-esteem, and our individuality. Ban.
How many choices are there for sex? I think there are lots of choices for gender identity.
Right. Right. In our culture, yes, there's also, I'm going to talk about that. Generally in our culture, we have 3 categories, male, female, and then intersex. And I'll talk about intersex in a moment. Okay, and to reiterate, the difference between gender identity and sexual orientation is the difference between who you are in your gender identity and who you love, who you're attracted to, and that's your sexual orientation. So to Van's point, transgender identities are someone who identifies with a gender identity, or gender expression that differs from the one they were assigned at birth. Okay. Transgender is more of an umbrella term for folks who, let's say, were assigned male at birth, but yet either identify as a non-binary person or may identify female. And then a cisgender person is someone whose gender identity aligns with what was assigned to them at birth. And then intersex is an individual who experiences biological variants that do not fit categorically into the binary of gender assigned at birth. And I want to tell you that that is also an umbrella term, and it's used to describe a wide variety of natural variations for people that are born with characteristics that don't fit into that male or female binary. In some cases, intersex traits are visible at birth. You may have some congenital visible variations, but in other cases, they're not apparent until puberty. Some variations may not be apparent at all. And experts estimate that between 0.05 and 1.7% of all people are born with intersex traits. So you have that. Jane.
And I know you're gonna have to repeat this but I had never really understood that the numbers were that high. We wound up in a small group discussion one time with a neighbor who is an endocrinologist. And essentially he put it into that category of like 1 in 1,000 and one. And that just kind of like totally opened my mind from that doctor going, and just making what could essentially be a life-altering decision for something that was, you know, a 5-second assessment that didn't then get some sort of screening and biological and let's do testing and let's check DNA. And yeah, he just said that the numbers are far more staggering. So can you kind of repeat that?
Yes. So Jane told us about an occasion where she had a conversation with a pediatric endocrinologist that we know who underscored the prevalence of intersex people and how complicated it can be for someone who is born intersex and is assigned at birth a gender, and then as they mature, grow up, really, you know, or have that conflict of not feeling like the gender they were assigned to. Lacey.
Would you tell us what binary is?
But binary is when we create a black and white category. Yeah, 2 choices. And, you know, otherwise considered like dualist thinking, binary thinking, either or, black or white. And gender in our culture has been conceived of in that fashion, you know. And I'm going to harken back to, you know, our post-war era culture too. Have any of you read the book by Kristen Dumas called Jesus and John Wayne? It's been on the New York Times bestseller list. Dumas is a professor of history with a focus on religion at Calvin College in Grand Rapids. And she comes out of the evangelical world and has written this amazing book looking at the rise of, for better or worse, a male-dominated, muscular evangelical Christianity, which conceives of Jesus as almost a John Wayne figure. And that she does a great job, you know, it's well sourced, but she looks at that post-war era and the rise of an evangelicalism that has like almost as one of its central tenets, this rigid binary of gender. You know, do you all remember the Total Woman, Maribel Morgan, back in the 70s? There's like Anita Bryant and these women that were out spreading this gospel that a woman's place was truly in the home, and, you know, women could fight best for God and country by being submissive and attentive to their husbands. And it really, you know, became a political force. And we still see that playing out today. So that binary puts a very rigid line between what is appropriate for men, what is appropriate for women. So yes, Marnie.
If a physician can determine at birth that an individual is intersex, are they still only given a choice of male or female?
From what I've read, there is a movement now to not do that and to have consultations with parents and give the parents yeah, a broader spectrum of understanding of how they can help this child navigate it without making an immediate decision.
But what's the birth certificate gonna say?
That's a good question. I don't know. But I will tell you that as of this week, the very first passport was issued with an X, meaning not male or not female. So there's a lot of work going on to try to move us away from that old binary. So pronouns. Some of you may have encountered, whether in your communication or meeting folks who use pronouns as part of an introduction. Now, my pronouns are she, her. I was assigned female at birth, and I identify as such today. But there are others who may say they, them, or him, they, he, they. So pronouns are important because they help reaffirm an identity. And when someone tells you their pronouns, using them is a form of respect and a way to create a more inclusive environment. I have actual buttons that I would love at some point in time that DCPC would attach maybe to our name tags, or we could write on our name tags our pronouns. That's something we'll talk about later as we discuss ways that our church can live into our inclusivity and affirmation. And it is important to never assume a person's pronouns, but allow them to self-identify. Okay, any comments or questions? And I will say this can be hard. Jane and I have a friend who goes by they, them pronouns, and I have to think, but I want to be hospitable. I don't want to be a sodomite, right? We don't want to be sodomites here. We want to be hospitable people. Yes, Dan.
Is it appropriate to ask an individual what their pronouns are if you are interacting with them for a first, second, or third time?
I think so. I mean, I wouldn't consider that offensive. I mean, go with your gut too. I think that would be okay. Any other thoughts on pronouns? Okay. And the golden rule, everyone has the right to define for themselves who they are and how they want to be identified. Now, a little editorial comment, nothing infuriates me more than people who think they know me better than I know myself. And I think we all can agree on that. So you'll hear people say, well, they're just pretending to be a woman, or, very dismissive and arrogant comments about someone else's identity. And to me, that's just beyond the pale, that we honor the image of God in everyone, and that image is different. And when someone tells you who they are, again, it is hospitable to accept that and to honor them. And then moving a little bit into how we can take this information and use it to make our church a more inclusive environment. And one is to make it a priority to train leaders and staff on concerns of diversity and inclusion. And this class is actually part of that, because in our tradition, we believe in a priesthood of all believers. We are all ministers. And so everyone in this congregation, I think, has the opportunity to to learn and grow and be trained. Change policies to reflect gender inclusion. Now, when you listen to, let's say, Peter Henry in a sermon, you'll hear him say very often the word siblings in Christ. Not brothers and sisters, but siblings. Now, that's an inclusive term that encompasses all sorts of gender diversities within it. So the language we use in worship, also the way we structure like our fellowship. We still have like a men's group and women's circles. Now, I understand the reason for that, but being aware of sometimes how we continue to operate under that binary, I think is important, just so we can ask questions and say, you know, who might we be excluding because of this? So normalize using pronouns and respecting diversity of gender in conversation and interactions. Use sermons and story examples that include gender diversity. And I've heard Peter do that. Check your liturgy and publications. Do they reflect what you believe? And then create inclusive spaces. And bathrooms, we all know how bathrooms have been contentious, right? Well, we do have a non-gendered restroom available here in DCPC. It is not at the front of our church where we have two identical bathrooms that are gendered. That's something we might want to think about. But also, when we walk into a Sunday school class, are the pictures on the wall reflective of diversity of gender? All sorts of things. Include days of importance on your liturgical calendar. We have an opportunity to do that on November 20th or the Sunday around that. And because November 20th is Transgender Day of Remembrance. And that is an internationally acknowledged day to remember all of the trans folks who have been murdered here in the United States and around the world. And our denomination has several liturgies available to include in worship to raise and honor our transgender siblings. And then self-educate, reach out, connect, learn what you don't know. And remember, we don't know anyone's gender until they tell us, to Van's point. And don't make assumptions. And then, as we're doing today, create educational opportunities for the congregation to grow and learn. I want to share with you two statements. Well, one statement that has come out of the PCUSA. In 2018, our General Assembly, which is the governing body of the PCUSA, issued a statement on affirming and celebrating the full dignity and humanity of people of all genders. And I'm not going to read through it all, but I want to focus here on point 3. The Assembly laments the ways that the policies and actions of the PCUSA have caused gifted, faithful LGBTQ Christians to leave the Presbyterian Church so they could find a more welcoming place to serve as they have been gifted and called by the Spirit. And then the Assembly calls on the church to seek to expand their welcome so that all may know the good news of Jesus Christ and encourage other communions to do the same. So our denomination has taken a pretty strong stance that we acknowledge gender diversity and we want to make amends for those who in the past have been pushed out of our church and find ways to be more affirming and welcoming in bringing in gender diverse folks back. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, the first line, the General Assembly also encourages congregations of the PCUSA to
Around the top of it, the top bar.
yeah. Minimize it. Okay, so there we go. We'll go back. Okay, so the General Assembly also encourages congregations of the PCUSA to welcome transgender and gender non-binary people into the life of the church and to continue to grow in compassion and knowledge about the full expression of our individual and respective gender identities. So, and that's a pretty liberating statement, I think. I think it's liberating for all of us that, you know, we can acknowledge, even within ourselves, that we are not necessarily just this black and white binary when it comes to our genders. I had a dream. I've got to share this with you guys. I had this weird dream. I told Jane this earlier this past week that I was standing in my closet and you all were all in my home. And I was inviting you into my closet because I wanted to show you that I said, look, I had this little black cocktail dress. Isn't it cute? But look, here's my, you know, cowboy boots, and see how gender expression can be so diverse. And then I woke up and I was like, that was weird, man. But it's true. I mean, we all embody qualities and characteristics that transcend these very narrow and rigid, culturally and socially defined categories. And that's actually true in the Bible too. So we talked last week a little bit about how the notion of complementarianism has been used against LGBTQ people out of the Genesis stories. Now, you all know that there are two creation myths in Genesis, right? Okay, the first one, scholars believe, comes from the priestly source, which is a later version, post-exile, after the Israelites had returned to the land. And then the second one is probably an earlier version of that story. But both were highly influenced by other ancient Near Eastern cultures. So the stories that we see in Genesis were not original, really, to the Hebrews, but they picked up on stories that they heard from the other cultures that were around them, right? What's interesting is that first Genesis story talks about the creation of man and woman. But what has always fascinated me is God, in the Hebrew, God is a plural. Elohim is referred to as plural. So when we created them in our image, male and female. So I'll never forget thinking that. I was like, so would that mean that Elohim, God, encompasses all genders? You know, and again, we're in a patriarchal society, pre-scientific, but even that notion that male and female is encompassed in the deity itself and that we are created male and female, not male or female, which is a distinction I found interesting. So, and then, the second story tends to be the one that's picked up on where, Adam's created out of the dirt and Eve is out of the rib. And the term helpmate in the Hebrew, there's some contention on how that should be translated. Partner, but unfortunately it's been used to justify that rigid binary in the past. But there are so many other stories in the biblical text that reflect gender diversities. And I want to move into the New Testament and focus on one section in Matthew where Jesus is being questioned by the Pharisees and those around him about marriage. And the question, or Jesus's response to the Pharisees says that, where is it? Okay, verse 12. So Jesus has said that marriage is good and that a man is better to marry. But Jesus goes on to say, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. There are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by others. And there are eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Let anyone accept this who can. So, what's a eunuch? Jesus is saying there are eunuchs that are born. There are eunuchs that are made by humans. And there are eunuchs who become so for the kingdom of heaven. Now, I try to be really careful about imposing modern categories on the text. But again, when I read this, I was like, because historically in the ancient Near East and the Greco-Roman era, eunuchs were not necessarily castrated. A eunuch could be someone who was trusted enough, for whatever reason, to be an official in a court. And, we have kind of a stereotypic vision of the eunuchs guarding the harems, right? Like they wouldn't be tempted to sexually engage with the harem. But that stereotype isn't necessarily true. There were other reasons why these men were elevated into positions of trust as well. And here is Jesus in the middle of a conversation about marriage saying, wait a minute, let's not forget that there are some people who, for whatever reason, don't want to get married. They were born that way, maybe, and then have been made so by men. And that to me reads more of that castration. And then those who become so for the kingdom of God. And that I hear that more of as a voluntary celibacy. And again, I try to be careful not to impose those back on the text, but that has always intrigued me, how Jesus, says, wait a minute. And then the final thing is, let anyone accept this who can. So that to me sort of indicates Jesus knows this is complicated. He says, you may not understand this. So in the New Testament, right there. And then another story that's really important about eunuchs is the one in Acts. Who was the first convert to Christianity?
Ethiopian.
Yeah, an Ethiopian eunuch. And again, being careful about imposing categories. A Black, gender nonconforming, gender diverse person was the first Christian. Maybe, yeah. So, but we're looking at, at these, and Jesus himself, I mean, my gosh, talk about breaking barriers and cultural stereotypes, Jesus's insistence on including women in his ministry, his close relationships with women in a culture where a man just, wouldn't do that. So we have such a rich, we have rich opportunities within the text to look and see how gender diversity has always been part of our faith and will continue to be. Any questions, comments, Jane?
I just need to stop share so that they
Oh,
can see
okay.
it.
Stop. Yeah.
Just the-
Okay, I see. There we go. There we're back now. Okay. So any thoughts, questions about our topic today? Yes.
Let's turn this whole thing around. Maybe this whole thing of sexuality is a current for it, a more current for it. People have looked into the 613 laws of the Old Testament to say this is why it's moral or a taboo. Maybe, if you look at the Greeks or the Persians or whatever, they certainly didn't look at, if you want to use the term homosexuality, they didn't look at it as something that should be avoided. The invincibles of the Persian army were encouraged to have male lovers to protect each other in battle. And
Right.
I think the hoplites were the same way, the Spartans. So it didn't come from there. There've been a lot of different things, but you think it could be more current, and we were looking at laws that in the past that could justify making it a taboo?
Yeah, that's a great point. So the question is, do we think that these attitudes, laws that have been imposed on LGBTQ people are a result of kind of a more current understanding rather than what, the cultures and societies in which these texts were written? And last week, I think, Pam raised that question about, do we think that these are more modern inventions? And just based upon the reading I've done, I would say yes, that it's a result of a more modern conception. That is not to say, however, that at certain places and certain points in history, there haven't been more repressive and restrictive understandings, but this cultural obsession almost with, anti-LGBT, like bathroom laws, all of this stuff is a modern invention that I think has something to do with that post-war milieu of, this, we have to return to a mythical past where we have a culture that is dominated by those who identify as male and then, maintain and police those very rigid boundaries between genders.
And Semitic,
Yeah,
a lot of cultures. The entire Semitic culture could have, if you look at the thoughts of, maybe we say the Middle Eastern cultures today still have that attitude.
Right, right. So other cultures, still maintain that attitude as well. But I wanted to let you know that in Jewish thought, through the Midrash and the Talmud, which are commentaries on the Hebrew text, there is a understanding of 5 genders. So in the Jewish tradition, they allow for 5 genders. And Rabbi Michael Shields, who used to be at Temple Kol Tikva, informed me of that once. And so I started researching it. And of course, sure enough, that is part of the Jewish tradition, is to recognize 5 genders. Now, is that carried out in every single context of Judaism? No. I mean, certainly the Hasidic communities and more conservative Jewish communities don't, but it's in there and it's part of the Jewish tradition.
What
Lacey.
about Buddhism? I think Buddha is sort of a both and.
Yeah. I wish I knew more about that, Lacey. I'm going to have to talk to my new friend who I met, Ivan. Ivan is the new Buddhist chaplain, I guess, at Davidson College. And actually, I met him at an LGBTQ event for alumni and students. So we have a wonderful resource here that can tell us more about that from a Buddhist perspective. Yes, Marnie.
Because it's all new to me, could you help me understand how the pronouns are used?
Mhm.
And what they mean when you say it?
Sure. So Marnie asked, how are the pronouns used and what do they mean when you say them? So when I introduce myself, say my name is Heather, my pronouns are she, her. What that means is when somebody refers to me, they say Heather, well, she is, or her, using those gendered female pronouns. But for folks who don't identify with a binary, either male or female, they will use the pronoun they, because that's not a gendered term. So they would say, my name is Aaron and my pronouns are they, them. So what that means for us is when we're talking about Aaron, we say, well, Aaron, they go to Davidson College. So we would use their preferred pronouns when we refer to them out of that hospitality. Does that make sense, Marnie?
So in that case, Aaron, they go to Davidson College, is used as a singular.
Yes. It's a confusing construction, but we're limited by the language that we have, which is gender.
So what is a transgender person or someone who's transitioning?
Okay, transgender is now used more of as an umbrella term, and it can encompass anyone who doesn't identify with the sex that was assigned to them at birth. But for some people, they experience what's called gender dysphoria, which is a very intense disconnect between the sex that they are assigned at birth and their feeling of who they are as a gendered person. Now, there's been a lot of debate, discussion about transitioning. When is it appropriate, allowable for someone who is transgender and experiencing gender dysphoria to make a transition? And I want to talk a little bit about that, in that I think as a culture, we see folks like Caitlyn Jenner and others, who have made a full social, medical, and in many cases, surgical transition to the gender with which they identify. But that is not always the case. There are folks who are transgender, but they may just transition socially, meaning they will take on maybe a new name, maybe going from Ann to our Aaron, and maybe express their gender differently. Perhaps, starting to wear, let's say Aaron was assigned female at birth, but Aaron now presents maybe wearing more masculine clothes, or what our culture would consider that, maybe a different haircut. But for Aaron, transitioning socially is okay, at least for them at that point in their journey. There are other people who may take puberty blockers if they're younger to stop that course of puberty, or later take hormones like estrogen if they're assigned male at birth, or testosterone on the opposite. And then there are other folks who determine that a surgical transition is right for them, and they have various surgeries, top surgery, transitioning from female to male, and then others. But it's never good form to ask, never cool to ask somebody. I mean, I know that's very personal. And also, if someone discloses to you that they are transgender, that's not your business to share. I know trans folks who have transitioned socially, medically, and surgically, who do not want their transition to be made public. And so again, we are hospitable and we honor them by not sharing that, and just, accepting and knowing them for all the wonderful things that they are. So Jane?
So to that point, it would, a transgender woman would likely at the end of that transition process just want to be known as she, her.
Right.
But you may have a person who in that transition process may be discerning and want to use they, them while they're still processing. And there have been people who have gone through primarily just like the medical versus surgical and realized that they're really more going to be in that intersex or in the non-binary, and not going to make a full transition, and maybe wind up staying as they.
Right. So Jane pointed out that, it is not necessarily true that everyone who moves through a transition will, take on the surgical options, and they may, find themselves and know themselves to be in that non-binary place. And that's certainly, valid. And
So in order not, to be respectful, you're not told, should you use an obvious gender pronoun? I mean,
yeah, I think that, when someone tells you, then that's a clear-cut case. But if someone doesn't tell you, I'll tell you, I go with the expression that I see. And the truth is, I've made mistakes. And when you make a mistake, just say, I'm sorry, learn and move on. And in my experience, I have found my non-binary and trans friends to be very, very cool about it. But it's when you persistently and deliberately misgender people or call them by their dead name. You ever heard of the term dead name? So if Aaron's name was Amy prior to their transition, we don't call Aaron Amy. And you'll see this now in the media. Maybe you've heard the actor Elliot Page, who was in a movie Juno back in the day. Elliot was in that movie before he transitioned. And so one of the big journalistic ethics concerns is, how do we refer to Elliot's performance prior to his transition when Elliot was a female actor who had a different name? But the courteous thing to do is to always use the name that the person tells you is their name. Any other? Oh my gosh, we are out of time. I could be here forever. Again, thank you. And next week, we're going to try to bring this all together. And very quickly, I want to just share with you a couple of really quick statistics to get your mind thinking of why this stuff is so important. 2020 was the deadliest year on record for transgender people. Transgender people LGBTQ people are 4 times more likely to commit suicide. Rates of homelessness for LGBTQ youth are 120% greater than their straight peers. Substance abuse rates of alcoholism are 25% greater. Triple the rate of hard drug use among LGBTQ youth. LGBTQ youth are significantly greater to be trafficked. Sexual violence against LGBTQ people is 7.4 times greater. And sadly, among LGBTQ people who have, in a study done by the University of Texas, those who have had exposure to religion are anywhere between 30 and 58% more likely to have suicidal ideation. So we have a lot of work to do. And next week, we're going to dig into this a little bit more and talk about ways that we can use the knowledge that we're gaining and our commitment through our faith here at DCPC to hopefully heal some of the damage that has been done and to be advocates and allies in our community for LGBTQ people of any or no faith. So thanks.
Thank you. I think you need to hit the live thing first.
Okay. There it is.
Hey, good question.
We invent new words all the time.
I know.